All right, well, I want to begin to compare and contrast now what you've laid out as the problems of the West with what we see in the rest led by China. But as we make that transition, I just wonder whether you think, on reflection, there is a bit of a problem with democracy, and whether democracy, Western style, can actually deliver the long-term strategic thinking that you've said is necessary to rescue the West.
Well, fundamentally, I'm a huge supporter of democracy. I do believe in democracy, but let's understand that it is not a prerequisite for economic growth. It is simply not. The fact that China is now the second largest economy on a GDP basis in the world, the fact that Singapore and Chile and many other countries have succeeded in moving hundreds of millions of people out of poverty without having a democratic system in place suggests that there is not just one model of economic growth.
But I'm going further. I'm asking you whether you think that democracy actually is hobbling
and that's what I'm coming to now,
efforts.
Stephen. That's what I'm coming to now. And I've alluded to this point already in my earlier remarks, in that the fact that governments are implicitly forced or encouraged or induced to focus on short-term factors, such as deficit financing, at the expense of longer-term issues that are structurally important for an economy, such as education and energy, as I mentioned to you earlier, and infrastructure, that is an inherent problem with democracy. That's not to say that we can't improve a democratic system, and I'll give you a specific example. Brazil, it's a democratic country. It has much longer terms, 7-year term for government, and it's a one-term country. However, there's much more flexibility for the government to be able to implement and to focus on structural issues rather than sort of pandering to the electoral cycle.
Yeah, and of course, China is the flip side, is the example of a command economy, capitalist in sorts, but a command economy with a highly centralized state, which has delivered the sort of growth that you've alluded to already. But seems to me there's a strong case, looking at China today, to say that you have overstated the degree to which the economic scales, global scales, are shifting in China's favor.
Well, look, the fact of the matter is China's come from nowhere to be the second largest economy on the planet. If you're asking me if China's going to keep growing, my answer is yes, absolutely. It's going to continue to post significant economic growth. If you're asking me,
when's it going to be bigger than the US economy, just in absolute terms?
I can't tell you precisely, but I can tell you what the estimates are. Some people think it's going to be as early as 2015. Other people think it's going to be 2020. I mean, if you're asking me whether China is going to continue to grow faster than Europe and the US, I also think yes, absolutely. However, if you're asking me whether China is going to be on a per capita level basis the same as the US and Europe, I can't tell you when that's going to happen because there are clearly resource constraints around the world.
Frankly, you can't tell me even if it's going to happen, never mind when.
They are definitely on the path. They have moved.
But they're so far
300 million people
away that you can't possibly predict what's going to happen. And let me just quote to you a very senior figure from a former member of the Monetary Policy Committee on the People's Bank of China, Yu Yongding. He was quoted in the press just before Christmas as saying, China's growth pattern has almost exhausted its potential, and he listed his fears for social tensions stoked by inflation. He talked about grave pollution problems. He pointed to the property bubble that we see in China's big cities, the over-reliance still on exports despite the efforts to get homegrown consumption going. This is a very senior player, deeply worried about China's economic future.
We should be worried. Absolutely, but my book is not how China was lost, it's how the West was lost. China has serious problems. It's got a huge population of people who are still indigent. There are more poor people in China than there are in Africa. They've got masses of people who remain undereducated. They've got serious concerns around infrastructure, around resources. They've got a massive task ahead of them. But the fact of the matter is they are sorting it out. They're trying their best to deal with these issues. And the issue is the US and our Europe doing the same thing?
Well, we'll get back to them in a minute. But it just seems to me that the danger of your argument and your excitement about what you see happening in the rest, led by China, is that you don't take account of the fact that they're on a growth path. And as they mature, they will become more like Western societies and inherit some of the problems that we've discussed in the West, not least, for example, an aging population. It's going to be a big problem in China very soon. Things like obesity, for example. You talk about how it's problematic in the West. It's becoming a big problem in countries like China and Mexico as well. So actually, as they develop, these economies are going to see many of the same problems the sort of systemic challenges that you talk about in the West.
Absolutely. I'm not disputing that. And in fact, if you look at the second half of my book, I explicitly lay out a whole range of issues. There's still issues around disease burden. There are issues around infrastructure, creaking infrastructure in places like China, everywhere from Nigeria across the emerging world. There's still concerns about power outages. I am not saying that everything is perfect in China. They clearly have fundamental, both tactical in terms of the property bubble, but also structural concerns around demographics and so on. But that is another book. And, you know, anything more than what I've written in the second half of my book is another book. I'm simply saying that there is a cavalier nature still pervading the policy hallways of Western countries. And that is something I consider undisputable.
All right, before we finish, let's bring it back to these Western countries then, because you say, you know, it is not too late. Mm-hmm. But then when you come to your prescriptions for what must be done, mm-hmm. They become more and more extreme. And in fact, more and more, to me, unrealistic. You talk about possibly the need for serious protectionism. And maybe in the long term, as a doomsday scenario, default. US defaulting on its debts.
Okay, Stephen, let's come back to earth for a moment. Those are obviously radical.
I didn't posit these things,
well,
you did.
I gave 4 scenarios at the end of the book. Okay, so first of all, those are not my recommendations. These are possible outcomes, and it is very possible. And the notion that people say, oh, well, you know, protectionism, oh my God, that's so shocking. Western countries engage in the most aggressive forms of protectionism. And as an African, I know that because Africa is a very good example of how African countries are unable to sell their goods into Europe and the United States. So the notion that protectionism is so far-flung and such a crazy idea is simply wrong.
I'm not for a minute suggesting it's a crazy idea or far-flung. What I'm suggesting is it may well, to some people, not least the governor of the Bank of England who talked about it the other day, seem like a crazy prescription for actually helping Western economies recover.
Well, let's look at the facts. Let's look at the facts. The United States has 10% unemployment. Around 30 million Americans are out of work in the manufacturing sector. And arguably, most American economists would also say those jobs are simply not coming back. Why? Because Americans are simply uncompetitive globally if you compare them to China or India, where people can make the same goods at a fraction of the cost.
Sure, so you think putting tariff walls up is going to make US industry more efficient?
The question is, how do you bring those people back to work? I would absolutely agree with you that the United States, in terms of innovation, will remain globally competitive. I mean, there is really no global competitor that could take the United States on. But with respect to the manufacturing sector, we need to be much more innovative. And unfortunately, protectionism is not off the table. It was a fringe issue, but it's definitely come back into the center.
But it doesn't encourage efficiency or indeed innovation, does it?
That's all theory, which I support 100%. I'm a free marketeer, but we live in the real world. And the US and Europe
I just wonder if default is conceivably ever a possibility in the real world.
There are people who would argue very convincingly that the US is already engaging in default by depreciating their currency. So
well, that's a very different argument.
It's a fair point, though.
But even a limited formal default would hit the US economy so hard in terms of millions out of work, hyperinflation, a currency that was becoming worth little more than the paper it was printed on.
Let's again look at history. Countries from Germany, Argentina, I mean, around the world, countries have resorted to defaulting. It is not off the table. It is not an ideal situation, but to sit here and assume that it's something that is completely impossible is also wrong.
Well,
countries have taken that as an option.
It's not that it's impossible. Clearly, economies in grave crisis like Argentina many years ago. Germany going back, these were economies in the gravest of crises. But you seem to be saying that a limited default might be a wise thing at some point for America to contemplate because it would be good for its economy, and I just don't understand that.
Well, as I said to you, what do you do with 30 million Americans who are out of work, possibly permanently? As a policymaker, everything is on the table. And I'm not saying that the default and protectionism options are ideal. What I am saying is that they're definitely on the table. And what used to be viewed as fringe issues, fringe policymaking, has definitely come to become a central issue in the United States. So protectionism, with the President Hu Jintao's visit to the U.S., is definitely something that is going to be discussed. The whole issue around China and the currency manipulation is around protectionism. And all I'm saying is that it is not off the table.
Nothing off the table then, but a final quick personal thought. Where are you going to choose to live the rest of your life? You know, you have choices. You are, in a sense, a sort of global academic. Are you going to head east to China, or are you going to make your life in the West, which you fear may be losing?
Who knows? I mean, the fact of the matter is, I spend a lot of time in many different places. I've enjoyed a wonderful life in the West. I've enjoyed a wonderful life in Africa. Who absolutely knows? It's really where the opportunities are. So we will wait and see.
Dambisa Moyo,
thanks very much for being on Hard Talk.
Thank you.